Some wounds change a person's life forever. A bullet can silence a voice. A single moment in the ocean can destroy a lifelong dream. And a medical diagnosis can convince the world that someone will never truly participate in life. But sometimes, the moment that appears to end everything becomes the beginning of something no one could have predicted. Malala Yousafzai was still a child when she began speaking publicly for girls who were being denied an education. The people trying to silence her eventually decided to do something. Bethany Hamilton was only 13 years old when a shark attack took her left arm. She had spent most of her childhood preparing to become a professional surfer, and Hoyt was born with cerebral palsy and spastic quadriplegia. Although he could not walk or communicate through ordinary speech, he would eventually inspire his father to complete more than 1,000 endurance events. Before we continue, if you're a fan of hopeful and uplifting true tales about sacrifice, perseverance, compassion, and people willing to go the extra mile, all delivered through a powerful story-driven format, then you have come to the right place. Please give the like button a little encouragement. It has already fallen down twice trying to carry the emotional weight of these stories. Then, follow and subscribe to Echoes of Hope and turn on all notifications so you do not miss our new weekly true stories about survival, compassion, resilience, second chances, and the extraordinary strength of the human spirit. Now, let's begin with a girl whose attackers believed one bullet would make the world forget her name. Instead, it gave millions of people a reason to remember it. Story 1. Malala Yousafzai, the girl they tried to silence. Malala Yousafzai was born on July 12, 1997, in Mingora, a city in Pakistan's Swat Valley. From the beginning, her father, Ziauddin Yousafzai, wanted his daughter to receive opportunities that girls were often denied. He was a teacher, an education advocate, and the operator of a school. In his classrooms, education was not treated as a privilege reserved for boys. It was something every child deserved. Malala grew up surrounded by books, lessons, debates, and the belief that knowledge could change a person's future. She loved attending school. For many children, going to class may feel routine. There are early mornings, homework assignments, tests, and days when staying home seems more appealing. But for Malala, school represented far more than a building. It represented independence. It represented the possibility of choosing what kind of life she would lead. And as the political situation in the Swat Valley became increasingly dangerous, that choice began to disappear. The Taliban gained control over the region and imposed severe restrictions on daily life. Music, television, and other activities were prohibited. Punishments were used to frighten people into obedience. Girls were told that they should no longer attend school. By January 2009, when Malala was only 11 years old, she was forced to say goodbye to classmates without knowing when or whether they would be allowed to return. Schools were not merely being closed. Some were being destroyed. Families had to decide whether sending a daughter to class was worth the danger that could follow. But Malala could not understand why being born a girl should determine whether she was allowed to learn. Instead of quietly accepting the restriction, she began speaking publicly about education. She also wrote about life under Taliban control for BBC Urdu. Because of the danger, she originally wrote anonymously. Her entries described what it was like to live in fear, watch classmates disappear from school, and wonder whether education would be permanently taken away. The writer was a child. But the situation she described affected an entire generation. As Malala continued speaking, more people began to hear her message. Her advocacy attracted international attention, and in 2011, she was nominated for the International Children's Peace Prize. She also received Pakistan's National Peace Award for Youth. Recognition brought support, but it also brought exposure. The people who opposed girls' education now knew exactly who she was. Malala continued anyway. That does not necessarily mean she felt no fear. Courage is often misunderstood as the absence of fear, but courage can also mean understanding the danger and deciding that the purpose is still worth defending. Malala was not demanding wealth or political power. She was defending a girl's right to sit in a classroom. And that simple demand was considered threatening by people who depended on silence and obedience. On October 9, 2012, Malala was travelling home from school with other students. A masked gunman stopped the vehicle and boarded the school bus. He asked for Malala, then he shot her on the left side of her head. 2 of her classmates, Shazia Ramzan and Kainat Riaz, were also injured in the attack. The attack was supposed to end Malala's campaign. The gunman's objective was not simply to harm one student, it was to deliver a message to every girl who might consider following her example. Speak publicly, and this is what could happen to you. But that message did not produce the result the attackers expected. Malala survived. She was initially treated in Pakistan before being transported to Birmingham, England, for specialised medical care. She woke approximately 10 days after the shooting in a hospital far from home. She had survived the bullet, but survival did not mean the ordeal was over. There were surgeries. There was rehabilitation. There was the process of recovering movement and strength. There was also the emotional reality of understanding why she had been attacked. She had nearly been killed for wanting children to attend school. Her home, her community, and the ordinary life she had known were now far away. Her family eventually joined her in the United Kingdom, where they began rebuilding their lives. Malala faced a decision. She could withdraw from public life and attempt to live quietly. No reasonable person could have blamed her for doing so. She had already sacrificed more than anyone should be required to sacrifice for a cause. But Malala believed that surviving the attack had given her an even greater responsibility. The people who tried to silence her had not changed her position. They had demonstrated exactly why the fight was necessary. The attack transformed Malala from a young regional activist into an international symbol of the right to education. But becoming a symbol carries its own burden. The public often sees the speeches, awards, photographs, and moments of recognition. It does not always see the private process required to continue after trauma. Malala still had to recover. She still had to return to her own education. She still had to build a future while millions of people attached expectations to her name. On July 12, 2013, her 16th birthday, Malala spoke at the United Nations and called for every child to have access to education. With her father, she established the Malala Fund, an organisation advocating for girls to receive the education they need to determine their own futures. Then, in 2014, Malala Yousafzai and Indian children's rights activist Kailash Satyarthi were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Malala was 17 years old, making her the youngest Nobel laureate in history. The student who had once written anonymously because using her real name was too dangerous was now standing before the world under that same name. But the award did not mark the conclusion of her work. It expanded it. Malala continued meeting girls whose education had been disrupted by conflict, poverty, discrimination, child marriage, and political restrictions. She began studying philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of Oxford in 2017 and graduated in 2020. Her education had once been threatened by armed extremists. She not only completed it, she used her public platform to fight for other girls to receive the same opportunity. Through the Malala Fund, she continued advocating for policies, funding, and social changes that support girls' secondary education around the world. Malala's story is often summarized as the story of a girl who was shot and survived. But survival is only one part of it. The deeper story is what she did after surviving. She did not allow the person who attacked her to determine the meaning of her life. She did not pretend that the pain had never happened. She turned that pain into evidence. Evidence that education matters. Evidence that a young person's voice can threaten an unjust system. And evidence that attempting to silence one courageous person can sometimes awaken millions more. The attack changed Malala's life forever. It separated her from the ordinary childhood she might otherwise have experienced. It required medical treatment, relocation, and years of adjustment. Hope did not erase any of those costs. Hope gave those costs a direction. The bullet was intended to place a period at the end of Malala's story. Instead, it became a comma. Her voice continued. And every time another girl enters a classroom after someone told her she did not belong there, the echo of that voice continues with her. Courage is not proven by never becoming afraid. It is proven when fear is given the opportunity to make the final decision, and you speak anyway. Malala had to decide whether she would continue using her voice after someone tried to take it away. Our next story begins with another young girl whose future appeared to vanish in a single violent moment. She had dreamed of becoming a professional surfer for most of her childhood. Then she woke in a hospital, missing the arm she had always used to paddle, balance, and push herself onto the board. Many people wondered whether she would ever surf again. Bethany Hamilton was asking a different question. How soon could she return to the ocean? Story 2. Bethany Hamilton, the surfer who returned to the ocean. For Bethany Hamilton, the ocean was not simply a place she visited, it was home. She could feel determined one day and frustrated the next. Growing up on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, Bethany began surfing when she was approximately 5 years old. She entered and won her first competition at 8. By 9, she had her first sponsor. Surfing was more than a childhood hobby. It was the center of her ambition. She spent hours learning how waves formed, how boards moved beneath her feet, and how small shifts in balance could determine whether she completed a ride or disappeared beneath the water. By the age of 13, Bethany was already building a path toward professional competition. She was young, talented, disciplined, and surrounded by a family that understood her love for surfing. Then, on October 31st, 2003, that future changed. Bethany was surfing off Kauai when a tiger shark attacked her. The shark severed her left arm near the shoulder. One moment, she was lying on her board in familiar water. The next, the ordinary movements she had performed thousands of times were no longer possible in the same way. Bethany's companions helped bring her back to shore, and she was rushed for emergency treatment. Her father was already at the hospital that morning, preparing for knee surgery. The operating room and medical team that had been prepared for him were suddenly needed for his daughter instead. Bethany survived. But when the immediate medical crisis passed, she had to confront what survival meant. She was still 13. She now had to relearn everyday activities that most people perform without conscious thought. Getting dressed, preparing food, tying her hair, maintaining balance. And beyond those daily tasks was an even larger question. What would happen to surfing? Paddling requires both strength and symmetry. A surfer must generate enough speed to match a moving wave. Then, in a rapid movement, the surfer pushes upward, places both feet onto the board, and finds balance before the wave passes. Bethany had spent years developing those movements with 2 arms. Now, she would need to create an entirely different method. People looking from the outside could reasonably believe that the shark attack had ended her competitive future. Bethany did not know exactly what returning would look like. She had no personal example of another one-armed competitive surfer to copy. There was no simple instruction manual waiting for her, but she knew she still loved the ocean. Only 26 days after the attack, on November 26th, Bethany returned to the water. Returning did not mean that everything immediately worked. Her first attempts required a larger longboard that provided greater stability. She had to determine where to position her weight. She needed to learn how to paddle with one arm without causing the board to turn off course. She also had to develop a new way to stand. On her third attempt, Bethany was able to rise and ride the wave back toward the beach. That ride did not mean every problem had been solved. It meant the problem could be solved. From there, the process became one of constant adaptation. Bethany gradually moved from longer boards toward shorter ones. She endured repeated wipeouts while trying to rediscover her balance. On difficult days, she sometimes could not get beyond the breaking waves. Duck diving, a technique surfers use to push their boards beneath an approaching wave, was particularly difficult with one arm. There were days when Bethany returned to the beach crying because she could not reach the lineup. Her father noticed that lifeguard boards sometimes included handles. That observation led to the addition of a handle on Bethany's board, allowing her to grip it more securely while moving beneath the waves. It was a practical modification, but it represented something larger. Bethany did not need the ocean to become easier. She needed a new way to move through it. Progress was not a straight line. Returning to the water within 1 month was extraordinary, but it did not make fear disappear. Bethany later explained that fully overcoming her fear of sharks took years. That distinction matters. People often look at someone who returns quickly after trauma and assume that person must no longer be frightened. But action and fear can exist at the same time. Bethany could love the ocean while also remembering what had happened there. She could be grateful to have survived while grieving what she had lost. Recovery is rarely one emotion. It is often several conflicting emotions arriving together. Bethany continued training. The goal was not merely to stand on a board once for a photograph. She wanted to compete again. Within 2 years of the shark attack, she won her first national title. By 17, she was competing professionally. Her life story received worldwide attention. Her autobiography, Soul Surfer, was published in 2004, and a feature film based on her experience was released in 2011. But Bethany did not want her identity to remain permanently frozen at the moment of the attack. She was not only the girl who lost an arm, she was a surfer, she was an athlete. She later became a wife, mother, author, speaker, and mentor. Her faith also played a central role in how she understood the experience. Bethany has consistently described her Christian faith, family, and community as essential parts of her recovery and purpose. The story became larger than competitive success. In 2007, Bethany's family and friends established what later became known as the Beautifully Flawed Foundation. The organization developed programs supporting young people, amputees, and families experiencing hardship. Its retreats give people living with limb loss or limb differences opportunities to connect with others who understand their experiences, develop practical skills, and build confidence. The private adaptations Bethany once had to discover for herself could now help someone else feel less alone. A young amputee entering one of those programs might arrive believing that nobody understands the frustration of relearning ordinary tasks. Then that person encounters a community of people who have faced similar challenges. The circumstances have not changed, but isolation begins to change. That is one of the most powerful transformations pain can undergo. A person experiences something they never would have chosen. They survive it. They slowly learn how to live with it. Then, one day, the knowledge they gained in their hardest season becomes guidance for someone who has just entered their own. Bethany's surfing career continued to include championship competition, demanding waves, global travel, and new challenges. But she has said that the most important part of her story is not simply the comeback, it is helping other people rise after the waves in their own lives. Bethany's story can easily become a message about refusing to quit. But there is another lesson beneath it. Perseverance does not always mean forcing yourself to do something exactly as you did it before. Sometimes perseverance requires accepting that the old method no longer works. You adapt the board. You shift your balance. You begin with smaller waves. You return to shore when the day becomes too difficult. Then you try again. The objective is not to pretend nothing changed. The objective is to discover what remains possible because you are willing to change with it. Bethany never received her old life back. She built a new one. The new life still contained the ocean. It still contained competition. It still contained fear, failure, ambition, family, faith, and purpose. But it also contained people who would see her story and believe that their own loss did not have to become the final definition of who they were. Healing did not return Bethany's old life. It showed her that a different life could still contain the same ocean. Bethany had to rebuild the physical movements that once carried her through the water. Our final story is not about one person overcoming an obstacle alone. It is about a father and son who discovered that when their strengths were combined, they could enter places neither of them could have reached in the same way without the other. The father supplied the physical movement. The son supplied the reason for every mile. And it all began with one 5-mile race they were expected to finish near the back. Story 3. Dick and Rick. Hoyt, the father who ran and the son who gave every mile meaning. Rick Hoyt was born in 1962 with cerebral palsy and spastic quadriplegia after a loss of oxygen affected his brain. He had very limited control of his muscles and could not communicate through conventional speech. At the time, children with significant disabilities were often separated from their communities and placed in institutions. Some people assumed that because Rick could not speak or control his body in the expected way, he could not understand the world around him. His parents, Dick and Judy Hoyt, refused to accept that assumption. They noticed that Rick followed people with his eyes. They believed their son understood far more than medical professionals initially recognized. The problem was not necessarily that Rick had nothing to say. The problem was that the available world had not yet given him a reliable way to say it. His parents fought for him to receive an education and to be included in public school. Judy also became involved in efforts that helped advance special education reform in Massachusetts. Eventually, technology provided Rick with an augmentative communication device. The system allowed him to select letters and communicate through a computer. For the first time, other people could access thoughts that had always existed but had been trapped behind physical limitations. The discovery changed how people understood Rick. He was intelligent. He followed sports. He had opinions, humor, ambitions, and a desire to participate in the same world as everyone else. The communication device did more than allow Rick to produce words. It gave him greater control over his own story. In the spring of 1977, when Rick was 15, a lacrosse player from his school had been paralyzed in an accident. A 5-mile benefit race was organized to help him. Rick told his father that he wanted to participate. There was one obvious complication. Rick could not run. Dick was also not a trained distance runner, but Dick agreed to push his son's wheelchair for the entire 5 miles. They entered the race and finished next to last. Running while pushing another person requires far more than ordinary endurance. The athlete must manage the added weight, maintain control through turns and downhill sections, and continue applying force when fatigue begins to affect every movement. But marathons were only part of what Team Hoyt would attempt. They moved into triathlons. For the swimming portion, Dick pulled Rick in a small boat attached to him by a cord. For the cycling portion, Rick rode in a specially designed seat connected to the bicycle. For the running portion, Dick pushed Rick in a customized racing chair. Every event required planning, specialized equipment, physical preparation, and cooperation. The objective was never for Dick to complete the course while Rick watched from the side. The objective was to cross together. They eventually completed 6 full Ironman competitions. An Ironman consists of a 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bicycle ride, and a full 26.2-mile marathon. Dick did not simply complete those distances himself. He swam while pulling Rick. He cycled while carrying him on the adapted bike. Then he ran the marathon while pushing him. The physical achievement was extraordinary, but focusing only on Dick's strength can miss half the story. "Dad, when I'm running, it feels like I'm not handicapped." Rick had spent his life depending on other people for movement, but during the race, the speed, cheering, wind, and shared effort gave him an experience of freedom. Dick understood that the race had not been a one-time favor. It had revealed something his son loved. So Dick began training. This was not an arrangement in which one person was the athlete and the other was simply being transported. Team Hoyt became a partnership. Dick provided the physical force required to move through each course. Rick provided motivation, direction, and the emotional purpose behind the effort. Together, they entered more races. Then they attempted longer distances. A 5-mile run became a 10K. The 10K became a half marathon. Eventually, they entered full marathons. Rick also pursued his education. He attended Boston University and graduated in 1993 with a degree in special education. He later worked with assistive technology researchers at Boston College, helping test and develop systems that could allow people with significant physical disabilities to control computers and communicate. The technology that had once given Rick access to the world became an area where his own experience could help improve access for others. Meanwhile, Team Hoyt continued racing. They became especially connected to the Boston Marathon, completing it together repeatedly between 1980 and 2014. In 1992, Dick and Rick crossed the United States by cycling and running 3,735 miles in 45 days. By the 2009 Boston Marathon, they had officially completed their 1,000th race. Their complete racing history would eventually include more than 1,100 events, short-distance races, half marathons, 72 marathons, duathlons, 257 triathlons, and 6 Ironman competitions. The numbers are impressive. But the deeper impact was cultural. At the beginning, many athletic events were not designed to include teams like Dick and Rick. Their presence forced organisers and spectators to reconsider what participation should mean. They helped make racing partnerships between able-bodied athletes and athletes with disabilities more visible. Other families began forming similar teams. Specialised racing chairs improved. Organisations developed programs that allowed more people with physical disabilities to experience road races and endurance events. Team Hoyt's message became known through 3 words: "Yes, you can." That phrase did not mean every person could accomplish every task without assistance. It meant assistance should not be confused with inability. In 1989, the family established the Hoyt Foundation to support young people with disabilities and promote inclusion in daily life. Its work continued through grants, assistive communication support, racing programs, and efforts to provide specialised chairs to other athletes and families. Dick Hoyt died in 2021. Rick died in 2023 at the age of 61. Their final race together had already been completed. But Team Hoyt did not end at the finish line. The foundation continued. Other racing teams continued. Athletes with disabilities continued entering events with family members, friends, and volunteers. The Boston Athletic Association has continued recognizing their legacy and described Rick as an icon who personified Team Hoyt's commitment to inclusion. There is a powerful image people often carry from the Team Hoyt story. A father is running. His legs are exhausted. His hands remain fixed on the racing chair. His son is seated in front of him. The crowd is cheering as they approach the finish. From a distance, it may appear that Dick is giving everything and Rick is receiving everything. But that is not how their partnership worked. Dick gave Rick physical movement. Rick gave Dick a purpose, powerful enough to carry him through distances he never imagined completing. Each made the other more capable. That may be the most hopeful lesson in their story. Strength does not always belong to one person. Sometimes it exists in the space between 2 people who refuse to leave each other behind. One has the legs, one has the vision, one pushes the chair, one gives meaning to every step, and together they enter a race the world once told them was not designed for people like them. Sometimes strength means crossing the finish line yourself. Sometimes it means ensuring that someone you love crosses with you. And sometimes the person you believe you are carrying is the person carrying the purpose inside you. Which of these 3 stories stayed with you the most? Was it Malala continuing to speak after someone tried to silence her? Was it Bethany returning to the ocean and rebuilding her dream one wave at a time? Or was it Dick and Rick Hoyt proving that strength can exist between 2 people working towards the same finish line? Share your answer in the comments. Your experience may be the encouragement another person needs to read today. If you believe that painful endings can become meaningful beginnings, please like this video, follow and subscribe to Echoes of Hope, and turn on all notifications for more uplifting true stories every week. every story leaves an echo. And sometimes, that echo becomes the hope someone else needs to hear.